Once again, this is something I'm doing on a whim. I just thought it would be fun. So today we're doing a tier list for all of the Fire Emblem games that I've played. So that is, they're out of order here, but it's basically, it's FE 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, and 3 houses. I intend to play all of the Fire Emblem games eventually, except for maybe 1 and 3. If you know what's up with the series and you know why I'd want to maybe skip those, and probably 2 as well. But anyway, yeah, I fully intend to play, I would say 4, 5, and 10 pretty soon. 10 is the, or 10, 11 is the only one I haven't played that's come out in America. But yeah, I just thought this would be fun. I think the exercise of making a tier list kind of justifies doing it. I know that sounds dumb, but like, it's just nice to have an excuse to talk about games that you like and kind of emphasize what you like about them and what you don't like about them. Really, like the end result of a tier list, that's not really the point, I feel like. It's the adventure that counts, right? Of course. And just like with the Pokemon tier list, I think it'll be fun to revisit this later on and see like how my opinions change. Maybe once I've played 4 or 5, I can be like, oh, well, I think that goes around here, or maybe it goes up here. So as I go through each game, I'll kind of describe my history with them, how many times I've played each game. I have beaten each game on here, at least once. So just one more thing I'm going to preface with. Once again, this is just my opinion. It's based just on how much I personally enjoy them and what I personally value in RPGs like Fire Emblem is usually story and characters and also gameplay. So I would say roughly in that order. So I value story and characters maybe a little more than other people do, but I still value gameplay a lot, obviously. Now see, with the Pokemon tier list, it was easy because we started with Gen 1, and I could put that in the bottom like immediately, which made it a lot more easy. I'll make that NA for now. But I think this time we're going to start with FE6. So Fire Emblem Binding Blade, it was the last game to be exclusive. Actually, that's not true. It was the last game before Fire Emblem 7 that was exclusive to Japan. This game features Roy, and it's kind of it's not really a sequel, but it is a sequel. It's a sequel to the game that came out after it. So FE7 is a prequel. Yeah. Since I'm not good at explaining these things, I'm not gonna bother in the future. So I guess that's one more thing I can preface with is that I'm not gonna claim to be like an expert on the series. You know, I don't do like low turn count runs or like solo runs. I just play for fun, and I'm not even that good at them, so. I've played Fire Emblem 6 once. It was on my stream. We played it kind of slowly over the course of a couple months. I enjoyed it just fine. It was the first GBA game. Roy is a perfectly serviceable protagonist. What I noticed about him is that he's actually not all that interesting by himself. He almost seems like their first take on like a self-insert protagonist, where like he's very passive, you know, like his personal growth isn't very important to the story. And I think especially like in the way how you can pair him up with like one of 6 of the female characters by the end of the game, it does kind of remind me of how they would do self-insert characters these days. But yeah, I don't care too much for Roy. He's kind of uninteresting. But FE6 has plenty of other characters that I like. I like Lilina, and I think FE6 has a lot of characters where I don't remember them because they were just cool characters on their own. I remember them just because they were fun to use. Like Sue was fun to use, and Lot, Rudger and Deke, Milady, Lou, just all these characters were like, I don't necessarily remember what they're all about in their supports and stuff, but I remember having fun using them. In terms of difficulty, FE6 is considered one of the harder games in the series. When I played on normal mode, so that's not the hardest difficulty. But yeah, I would say I struggled with it a decent amount. I don't think there were many chapters where like we had to start it over like 5 or 6 times, but there were a decent amount where we had to start it over at least once. As far as placement on the tier list goes, I think this works just fine. If yeah, I think C tier feels pretty good for FE6. I don't think I have much else to say about it, honestly. One thing I guess I can say is that I think FE6 has a really good amount of replay value because there's just this huge cast of characters. There's like 40 characters in the game, which is kind of insane. Although some of those characters are very bad, so I don't know. Maybe that's not. Maybe it doesn't count. I don't know. But anyway, we can move on. Fire Emblem 7. This was the first game to come out in America. Here we just call it Fire Emblem. In Japan, I think it's called Fire Emblem Blazing Blade or Blazing Sword. I've played it twice. I played Eliwood normal mode and Eliwood hard mode, and both times I played Lin mode. I would say going from FE6, FE7's a pretty big improvement just as far as like the protagonists go. I think Eliwood, Hector, and Lin are all individually more interesting than Roy. I would say I enjoy following their stories more than Roy's. And also, I imagine my opinion on FE7 will change a lot after I play Hector hard mode, or just Hector mode in general. Hector hard mode is like the big boy Fire Emblem game that people seem to like talking about, so I'll have to do that eventually. I think also my enjoyment of the game will depend a lot on how quickly I can get used to not playing Lin mode, because for some reason when I went back to do my second playthrough, I kind of insisted on doing Lin mode just because I was like, oh, well, that's the complete experience. You gotta start with Lin mode, but really you don't. Lin mode's kind of a waste of time. I say that because like when I think of FE7, I seem to recall it taking a long time just to finish it because of all of the Gaiden chapters. So the game is 30 chapters, but then with the Gaiden chapters, there's certainly more than 30. There's gotta be like 38 or 39. So I think skipping Lin mode is the way to go in the future. In terms of gameplay, I don't have much to say really. The mechanics are pretty straightforward. It's perfectly fun and enjoyable. Yeah, I really don't have much to say about the gameplay in FE7. Maybe the lords aren't great, but I mean, that's kind of a constant throughout all the games, so whatever. I think I might bump up FE7 to B tier for now. That might go down later though, like I might put it here. I'm gonna put it there for now though, because like I said, I just think it's more interesting to follow these character stories as opposed to Roy's, and I think FE7 has less maps that make me groan. Binding Blade has a couple maps where I'm like, okay, this just seems like a chore to play. So there's that. Yeah, honestly, I don't have too much to say about FE7. I think I'm going to leave it there for now. We can move on to Sacred Stones. So I've only played Sacred Stones once. It was actually one of the last games I played. I played it once for the first time about 3 years ago, I guess 4 years ago at this point. I played Erica normal mode, so the game was completely trivial by the end. And I didn't even use Seth, I just used a bunch of characters that I liked. And even though I had a pretty big squad of characters, they all became death machines by the end, so yeah, the second half of the game was completely trivial, which was kind of a bummer, because, you know, the later chapters just weren't that fun to play. I think Sacred Stone's a lot like FE7. My opinion on it will change once I play Ephraim hard mode, I imagine. Speaking of Ephraim and Erica are pretty good protagonists, I would say. Erica clowns on herself toward the end. Oh, yeah, that reminds me. This is gonna have complete spoilers for all the games except for Three Houses Golden Deer, because I haven't played Golden Deer yet. Erica makes a mistake toward the end of the story. She like trusts Lion when she shouldn't, and people kind of clown on her for that, but I think that's a pretty good character moment. I like it when protagonists are flawed in some way. I think you can say something similar about Ephraim too, where like he's clearly not perfect. I mean, I wouldn't say he's morally ambiguous, but he is what he is. You know, he just kind of has his shtick. I don't know. But yeah, they're perfectly enjoyable characters, and I think a lot of the characters in Sacred Stones are pretty enjoyable, especially if you look into the supports, like Joshua and some others I can't think of. I think that since the difficulty was so trivial on my first playthrough, I think that will leave it below FE7, but I might put it above 6? I don't know. I will say Sacred Stones has some good villains. Volter and Kalik and Lion are all pretty memorable. Yeah, don't have too much to say. In terms of mechanics, these three games are all very similar, by the way. Oh, you know what, though? Sacred Stones has the split, what do you call it? The split promotions on all the characters, which makes it a little more interesting for replays, so I can give it a nod for that. Maybe like this? I will say, having all the GBA games like in the same tier makes sense to me, but I might leave it like this for now. I would say I'm equally likely to revisit all these, although I will give some priority to these two because they have like new modes I haven't played yet. Okay, now we get to the big boys. We have Fire Emblem Path of Radiance for the GameCube. So this was technically not the first game I played, but it was the first one I beat. My first complete playthrough of a Fire Emblem game was Path of Radiance Easy Mode. And if you don't know, the North American version of Path of Radiance has an easy mode that isn't actually in the Japanese game. So the Japanese game has normal, hard, and maniac. Our version cut maniac mode and added easy mode. And despite easy mode in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance being notoriously easy, I still struggled with it because I was young and stupid and not experienced with the series. Right off the bat, I think Path of Radiance might have the single best story in the series as like a standalone game. If you kind of start combining games, like if you combine 6 and 7, and if you combine 9 and 10, then maybe I would say something else. But yeah, I think Path of Radiance has the best standalone story. I think Ike's character arc is interesting to follow, but it's interesting because they don't really emphasize on it too much throughout the story. Like there aren't any big moments where it's like, oh wow, Ike, you've grown so much. Like his growth kind of happens implicitly, and I think it may actually be an example of a time where they actually try to communicate a character's growth through how useful they are in the gameplay, because Ike is actually pretty damn useful, especially after he gets Ragnar, obviously. I know there's kind of a debate on how good Ike is gameplay-wise, especially compared to other characters, but I like using him, personally. Speaking of Ike, like not even just in terms of gameplay, in terms of just himself as a character, I think most people like Ike, but then there are some who don't, they just don't like him as much, they think he's kind of boring, but he's probably my favorite protagonist. I like that he's not a lord. That's pretty atypical in the Fire Emblem games. Now I know technically it's like, oh well, in the first place he was a lord in Dane, but then his dad left and he's technically a lord, but it's not the point, you know? His character arc has very little to do with the fact that like he was a lord in the first place, I guess. He's very much positioned to be like just a mercenary who just so happened to get caught up in like a worldwide conflict, which I think is interesting. I think it's cool that you can draw parallels between Ike and Ashnard. Ashnard is the game's main antagonist, how they both are seemingly pretty cynical about like established kind of, what am I trying to say? Both of them are cynical about how the power structures work in certain countries. Like they don't really agree with like the system of of nobility. There we go. They don't agree with the system of nobility. Both of them seem to think that power should trump that. Or I guess Ashnard in particular believes that, and then Ike is more like he just doesn't get it. So you have moments where like Ike is talking to Sonaki, who's like the apostle of Benyon, and he's speaking very bluntly and plainly, the same way he would talk to anybody else. I think Path of Radiance has maybe the single most memorable villain out of the whole series, which is the Black Knight. I just think Black Knight's a really cool character. He looks cool, he's really strong, and that's all you need, really. He doesn't have to be a super complicated character. I know in Radiant Dawn they go more in depth on the Black Knight, but really, like, you know, not every villain has to be super deep. It could just be like the big bad dude in black armor who's really strong. I'm talking a lot about the story. So the gameplay, even outside of easy mode, Path of Radiance is pretty easy. I guess I forgot to mention, I've played Path of Radiance 3 times. So originally I played it on easy mode, then I went back and played it on normal mode, and then hard mode. Path of Radiance has a lot of chapters with kinda alternative goals, so like, there's the one map I'm thinking of where it's like that dock town, and it's the one where the Black Knight appears halfway through. And in that one chapter, there's so much different shit you can do. You can recruit Zahark, you can try to spare the Vigilantes if you can. There's the desert chapter where you can try to spare the Laguz units to get more bonus XP. There's like the hidden items in the sand you can get. I just remember Path of Radiance having a lot of chapters like that, and those chapters are fun because they give you other things to try to accomplish. Maybe, I don't know how my opinion would change of Path of Radiance if I had access to the Maniac difficulty. The Maniac mode in Path of Radiance just seems awful, so I think hard mode might just be the way to go for that game as far as I'm concerned. There's probably a lot more I could talk about with the story. I like so many of the characters from Path of Radiance, like Titania and Alencia and Soren and Oscar and Shinon. There are so many of them. I think one thing that Fire Emblem in general does really well, and maybe like specifically in Path of Radiance, is that there are characters that are likable despite being bad people. Like Shinon, clearly not a good person at all. He's like racist, and he like tries to fight Ike more than once, but he's memorable because that's just the way he is, and he's your friend, so it's whatever. And I think you can say something similar about the characters in these games too. Although I can't think of any. I can think of Saul, but none others besides him. Alright, I think we're ready to move on. I spent a lot of time talking about Path of Radiance. And like, I know it seems like I'm talking a lot about the story and the characters, but I don't know, in most cases I think the gameplay in FE games are pretty similar. You kind of know what you're getting into, no matter what. But there will be some cases where I make it a point to say, oh, this game has really good gameplay, or this game has really bad gameplay compared to the others. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn is a direct sequel to Path of Radiance. It occurs 3 years after the events of Path of Radiance, and I can already tell you it's my favorite game, so it's going to go up here, and a lot of this is just going to be me explaining why, like, the things that people don't like about Radiant Dawn are things that I actually like about it, so I'm just going to cycle through all of the primary complaints with Radiant Dawn and talk about why I either don't mind them or why I actually like them. So I think maybe the first thing people think of in Radiant Dawn is, for the first part of the game, you're playing as the Dawn Brigade, who is, they're completely separate from the Grell Mercenaries. You don't get the Grell Mercenaries until later, so for the first part of the game, you're stuck using the Dawn Brigade, and they're not very strong. Your main lord is Micaiah, who can use light magic and nothing else. Your Jagan, quote-unquote, is Soth, who is pretty good, but I mean, he's not, like, as useful as a paladin would be in other games. And besides those two, you get, like, Edward and Nolan and Leonardo and Laura and Aaron, and they're just not super useful. So yeah, people knock Radiant Dawn because for a significant portion of the game you're stuck with the Dawn Brigade, and they're just not that good, and people think they're not fun to use for that reason, but I think they're actually fun to use. So, for example, Edward, like, he's not particularly good. For the most part, like, if you want to do, like, an optimal playthrough, you would just ignore Edward, and you would wait until you get Zahark instead. But Edward is just fun to use, I think, because you can invest XP in him early on, and it kind of pays off. He becomes really strong. You can turn him all the way into a True Blade if you want, and he'll be just a really powerful unit. And I know that may not be like the optimal thing to do, like you might be better off using Zahark, but I think a lot of people have fond memories associated with Radiant Dawn because they did things like that with Edward or Nolan, maybe not Leonardo. And I don't know if this argument's been made before, it probably has, but I think the Dawn Brigade was made bad on purpose to try to help communicate that they're just not as capable as the Grell Mercenaries. And so later in the game, when you end up having the Dawn Brigade fighting the Grell Mercenaries, it's like you already know that the Dawn Brigade's at a disadvantage. You know that because you've used those units and you know they're not very good. So I think them being bad is actually another example of them trying to communicate something through the gameplay, which is that the Dawn Brigade is kind of the perpetual underdogs no matter what. Now, I know that's a very optimistic view of it. Some people would say, how can you think they're made bad on purpose when you have, like, Meg and, what's-her-face, Fiona, where, like, they're so irredeemably bad that, like, they must have just been incompetent. There's no way they just did this on purpose. And, yeah. So that's one bad thing about Radiant Dawn, is that, like, more than any other game, like, you get a huge advantage if you have just some foresight going into it. Because, like, you need to know that you're not supposed to invest XP into Meg and Fiona. So Radiant Dawn is ripe with pitfalls for new players, which is why you absolutely should not play this game as your first FE game. Now, probably the reason why I put Radiant Dawn so high is because I like the story so much. And some people are down on the story because of a couple things, but primarily the thing I hear about it is the Blood Pact. So what ends up happening is that for the first part of the game, you're Micaiah and you're kind of leading Peleus, sort of the same way Ike led Elentia in the previous game. And when you get to part 3, you're playing as Grail Mercenaries, but suddenly the Dawn Brigade is forced to fight the Grail Mercenaries because Peleus signed a Blood Pact, which puts the two armies in an awkward position where they're like, oh, we have to fight each other even though we don't want to, we don't have a choice. And people understandably look at that and they say, oh, this is just contrived. This was just a contrived excuse to get the two armies to fight each other. And I think if you look at it in a vacuum, like if you just boot up Radiant Dawn and you go straight to, like, what is, like, part 3, chapter 8 or 9, where we have, like, the two armies fighting each other on the river, like, I can get why you'd be like, oh, okay, this is just contrived and it's bullshit, but hear me out. I think they spend, like, literally the first, like, entire part of the game with the Dawn Brigade basically setting the scene for the Blood Pact, because for that entire first part of the game, like, you're learning about Micaiah and Peleus. Like, they basically show you that Peleus is a pretty weak leader. Like, he can't inspire his troops at all unless the Black Knight, like, intimidates them beforehand. And by the time you get to part 3, I think it's perfectly believable that he would fall for the Blood Pact, which gets his country into the war with Benyon in the Laguz Alliance. And then that's just Peleus. With Micaiah, I think they establish, once again, in the first part of the game, that, like, she cares a lot about the people of Dane, and so it makes sense that she would want to go to war with the Laguz Alliance, even though it's not the right thing to do. It just makes sense from her perspective, given, like, what you know about her character. So I think that's a pretty good primer on why I personally don't mind the Blood Pact, and why I actually kind of like it in the context of the greater story, because it just makes perfect sense that Peleus would fall for it, and that Micaiah would stick with him despite it not being the right thing to do. Speaking of Micaiah, she's one of my favorite protagonists in the series, and people have gone back and forth on her for a while. There was this narrative that, like, Micaiah was a Mary Sue and she could do no wrong. I think people have kind of gotten over that. If anything, the pendulum has, like, swung back to the point where people are like, okay, Micaiah just makes bad decisions, because, like, with the Blood Pact, you could argue, like, the right thing to do clearly would be to cooperate with the Laguz Alliance and just kill Lacane as quickly as possible. That way, like, even though you're breaking the Blood Pact, you can still wrap up the war as quickly as possible and avoid having too many people in Dane die. But just explaining that, I think it makes sense why Micaiah wouldn't want to do that, because she doesn't want to risk it. She doesn't want to risk people in Dane dying for no reason. Anyway, I was talking about that because I was saying, like, I don't feel like Micaiah can be a Mary Sue because she just makes bad decisions sometimes. And that's okay, I think. Like I was saying earlier, I think characters are more interesting when they are flawed in some way. And I think Micaiah's questionable decision-making just makes her more interesting. Especially when she's, like, foiled with Ike, where Ike is like, dude, what are you doing? And that brings me to yet another complaint that people have about Radiant Dawn's story, which is that Ike he's in the story, and he kind of takes the spotlight away from the Dawn Brigade, like, halfway through the game. It's like, just kidding, I'm the main character again, and I can get why people find that kind of weird. The story kind of like fawns over Ike, where like all the other characters are like, oh no, Ike's really strong, he's invincible, he was the commander who beat Dane, he's like invincible, and like even through gameplay it's kind of communicated that Ike is literally invincible. And I think people take issue with that because like it's almost like a form of player worship where it's like this character can literally do no wrong. But I don't mind it because kind of like how I was talking about how like the first part of the game set up the third part of the game. I think like the entirety of Path of Radiance sets up the fact that Ike is really strong. I think there's some novelty in the idea that you have a character who is basically at the end of their character arc, where like they've had an entire game of their own to become strong and become virtuous and all that. Like it'd be kind of like if they did a sequel to Echoes, where Alm is still just around and he's really strong and powerful and nobody questions him because he's like saved the entire continent. It'd be kind of like that, and I think having a character around like that is just interesting because you don't usually get that, I don't think. It kind of answers the question, how would they treat Roy after the events of FE6, or how would they treat Ephraim after the events of FE8? So in summation, I guess, a lot of these complaints with the story and the characters, I feel like they aren't that bad when you look at them in the context of the greater story across both games. And I think that might be the thing that Radiant Dawn does best, is that it just has this incredibly, it's this huge story, and it's really convoluted. It has so many countries and characters in it that are important, and I just think that following that story is really interesting, and when you do second playthroughs of it, you end up, like, remembering and learning different things from the first time, because there's just so much going on that it's impossible to keep up with all of it on your first playthrough. Like, in your first playthrough, it might go over your head, like, what's going on with Kilvis and Isala. It might go over your head what's going on with, I don't know, frickin' anybody, I don't know, Sonic-y. But yeah, the story is so convoluted and crazy that it's just fun to follow, and I think it actually all comes together pretty well by part 4. And the endgame in Radiant Dawn is really satisfying because it really feels like it's the entire continent versus just one entity. So you finally get to use like Tabarn and Kanagas and Nyla and all these crazy characters that are incredibly strong. I'm looking at my list of like notes, and I have even more things to say about Radiant Dawn, so I'm gonna try to speed it up. The unit availability in Radiant Dawn admittedly is pretty bad. So you have some units where like Tormod and his squad, like they show up briefly in part 1, then they go away until part 4, and then there's like most of the units in part 2, where like Lucia and Joffrey and Kyran, all these characters who are pretty cool, you get to use them for like 2 or 3 chapters before the end game. It's kind of lame. But I just find myself not caring that much about it because I've never been burned by that. Like I never had a playthrough I was like, oh, I know, I'm gonna use Lucia and I'm gonna invest a bunch of XP in her and then I'll get to use her for the whole game. That hasn't happened to me. So I think the game gives you a pretty decent amount of characters that you actually get to use for the majority of the game. So there's that. I don't really mind the bad availability on some units. The lack of support conversations is a huge bummer. I can see why maybe they didn't want to do it because like the game is already very ambitious in some ways, and trying to figure out how to get support conversations to work logistically would be kind of a nightmare. Because the context of the story is changing so frequently, so the supports would have to be like in the newer games, like Awakening and Fates, where they just talk about some other bullshit besides the actual war. So yeah, I think it's fair to knock Radiant Dawn for not having support conversations, because there are some characters like Nolan and Edward where it'd be really cool to know like where they're from and where they're all about, but you never get that. So that's a huge bummer. I think, you know, I could actually see how somebody would knock Radiant Dawn significantly for that. I think I'm almost done. One thing I will say is I really like part 2 in Radiant Dawn because it's just this kind of new thing that they haven't done in Fire Emblem before, where you have like where you have 4 or 5 chapters where you get to use units that you haven't had a chance to train yet, and so the game is it's almost like the game is giving you preloaded scenarios for you to play. So they're just like, here are the units you get. They haven't been trained yet. Just try to complete the map to the best of your ability. And it's just kind of a fun thing you can do. And of course, Part 2 Endgame is a very famous chapter because it's just a lot of fun. I think I'm finally done with Radiant Dawn. At least almost done. I mean, people talk about how, like, Radiant Dawn is like enemy phase, just non-stop. So it's kind of slow-paced in that way, and I can get why people say that, but I just don't mind it. I don't mind playing mostly around enemy phase. Okay, finally, moving on to Awakening. So Awakening introduced Pair Up. Pair Up is a mechanic that lets you pair up 2 units and they fight together, and it's just a really broken mechanic that ruins everything. You can make really overpowered pairs that way. They attack together. The paired unit can defend like the leader unit. It's a very overpowered mechanic, and I can get why people didn't like it at first. Speaking of mechanics, Awakening also had same turn reinforcements for the first time since, I think, Binding Blade. And so I played... Oh yeah, so for Awakening, I've played it twice. I played it once when it came out on normal mode, and I played it once recently on hard mode. Actually, I think I may have played it both times on hard mode, but anyway, when I played it recently, I found it way easier than I did before because I have like 3 or 4 more years of experience under my belt with the series, and so also this time I actually knew how to use the second seals. So in terms of difficulty, the second seals kind of ruin everything. They basically let you reset your character's level back to 1, and you keep the stats from before, but you can keep leveling up to get even more stats. It's very broken. So I think Awakening probably has to get knocked for difficulty. Speaking of pair up, we also had the child mechanics. I don't know what else to call it, but you can pair up your units, and after a certain point in the game, you will get their offspring as new units you can use, and sometimes they're very strong. I've always opted to just not use the child units in Awakening and Fates, just because by that point I already have units I'm invested in. So, but I can get why some people like it. In my most recent playthrough, I used Morgan a little bit, and she was good. People are very down on the story in Awakening, but I just find it pretty inoffensive myself. I just don't have very strong feelings on it. I think Chrome's a perfectly likable character. Robin is very whatever. I think like the secondary characters in the story are more interesting. Like Basilio is cool, Flavia is cool. I'm sure there's more, but yeah. There's that entire arc of the story that happens in Valm, right, where you fight Walhart, and I know people don't like that part of the story, but I just find it pretty inoffensive. I don't know, maybe it's like a suspension of disbelief thing, where it's like, oh, we just so happen to have like this. We just happen to have this like conqueror dude who's trying to mess everything up, like in between 2 of the main story beats in the story. But I just don't find it that offensive, so I would say I'm very indifferent towards Awakening in general. Awakening kind of gave the franchise its reputation for being a dating sim for a little while, but I think in the context of Awakening's story it made perfect sense, where you have characters actually coming back from the future to try to help you, so I'm not going to knock it for that, but I think I will actually leave it down here in D tier. I wouldn't say we get to the games that I actively dislike until we get to E tier, so in fact I may end up doing something like this, where, you know, I move these up to B tier, but for now I'll keep it like this. I talked about Awakening for like 5 minutes, and I talked about Radiant Dawn for like 20, but whatever. Okay. Fates is next. So we have Fire Emblem Fates, Birthright, Conquest, and Revelations. I'm gonna pee. Okay, so I've played... I first played Conquest when that came out, then I played Birthright, then I played Revelations, and now recently I'm replaying Conquest. So I've played these games once each, and then Conquest, you figure it's like 1.5 times. Yeah, I think I'll just start by putting Birthright down here. Remember, I really value the story and the characters in these games, but people say that Birthright has a better story than Conquest, and I'm like, okay, if it does, it's like just barely. Because like the story in Birthright is so straightforward and predictable, especially compared to Conquest story. I played Conquest first, and like even if the story was like weird and Corrin makes bad decisions, like it was still more interesting than what happens in Birthright. Birthright is just so predictable compared to Conquest, and I just found it so boring to play it for that reason. Birthright's also really easy. You get the maps you can grind on if you want to. Conquest doesn't have those. Um, yeah, I just have very few nice things to say about Birthright. The only good thing it has is that like it lets you use, just cool characters like Hinoka and Takumi and Obro and plenty of others. I like those characters. It's just too bad I couldn't play with them, like in the context of Conquest instead of Birthright. Revelations can also go down here. I remember enjoying Revelations more than Birthright, actually. I know that's weird, because people really hate Revelations, but like... So my thing with Revelations is that it at least has like the novelty of letting you use all the characters from both routes, and you can like support them with each other if you want, which is neat. You can use like Xander and Ryuma, and they're both really strong. It's just kind of cool. The story in Revelations, quite bad, but whatever. I think it has a cool villain. Hanakos is cool, although you have to like kind of do research after the fact to understand what's really going on with him. And then there's like that weird plot twist toward the end where it's like, Gunter was your friend. Just kidding. He's a non-Kos. What? Yeah, it's weird. There's a lot of weird shit going on in Revelations. But Revelations has some really dumb gimmick maps that I know everybody hates them, but it still offers a different experience compared to what you can get from these other games. So for that reason, I'm going to put it above Birthright. And I'm going to put Conquest at least up here. So Conquest, at the very least, has better gameplay than both of these games, absolutely, because it's more challenging, and the objectives for each map are just more interesting. Like in Birthright, I think they're all like root the enemy. Conquest has some that are like kill the boss, or escape this map, or find the correct unit. It's just more interesting to play for that reason. Also, going from Awakening, they kind of fixed pair up, where it's still a very strong mechanic, but it's not as like overwhelming as it was before. Like now there's actually an incentive to not pair up, because if you don't pair up, you can be more offensive in the way you approach maps, because you can't do like pair up follow-up attacks if you're paired up. That didn't make sense. You can't do like ally follow-up attacks if you're paired up. But if you are paired up, then you're more defensive, because then your opponent can't do follow-up attacks like that. Not just Conquest, but all three games have the childbirthing mechanics that Awakening had. I guess people just really like them in Awakening, so they didn't want to get rid of them, but in the context of Fates, it really makes no sense at all for them to be there. Which is kind of a shame, because some of the characters they came up with for the child units are kind of cool, but there's no reason for them to exist, so yeah. I'm kind of indifferent towards the child units, because I just don't use them typically. I think I used Selkie in Birthright, but that was basically it. I can talk more about the story in Conquest. So, I think Conquest has some good ideas. Like, from Corrin's perspective, I feel like going with Nor is just that's not the right choice to make, clearly. And I like the idea that throughout Conquest's story, they're like kind of, they're having to pay retribution for making the wrong choice in the first place. So they have to like slaughter people when they don't want to, or they just, I don't know, dude. Conquest is weird. Like, what I mentioned, I've been replaying Conquest recently, and I was skipping the cutscenes until chapter 14, and that's the one where they're like, not only did we kill Scarlet, we made an example out of her. It was it was horrible. And I was like, holy shit, I don't remember this being a thing. So Conquest is weird. And then there's the chapter where I completely forgot about the one where it's Azura tries to curse Garen, and I forgot how like hilariously oblivious all the other characters are. They're like, "Who's that mysterious dancer?" And then Azura shows up, and Corrin's like, "Azura, did you see a mysterious dancer escape the concert hall?" So I can get why people meme on Conquest's story, but it has some cool ideas, and I like that the final boss is different. I like that you're fighting an archer as like the big bad final boss, and once again I like the idea that Corrin is having to actually pay retribution for making the wrong choice in the first place, which is what she did. I think that's all I really have to say about Conquest. I could probably say more about the story and why I don't hate it as much as everybody else does, but I can move on. And we're actually almost done. So next we have Echoes. Echoes is a remake of the second game, which was Fire Emblem Gaiden. It features Alm and Celica. For, yeah, basically the majority, or the whole game, you're playing as two separate armies, one that's led by Alm and one that's led by Celica. I guess I can start by talking about the story. So the story in Echoes is actually very basic, I would say. Alm isn't really a morally ambiguous character at all. Apparently that's how he kind of used to be in Gaiden, maybe. But yeah, he's a very straightforward protagonist. Celica's pretty whatever. The story is very basic, but I think what makes it enjoyable is just that the presentation value in Echoes is like through the roof. Like the voice acting is all really excellent. It's a good looking game, all the portraits look good. The supports are all good, even though there aren't very many of them. It just has a really good presentation for any game, but especially for a Fire Emblem game. Like for example, Berkut is a pretty basic villain. Like his motivations are very straightforward. He doesn't have like a crazy character arc where he becomes good by the end. But I mean, the presentation of the game just makes his whole deal just so much more interesting to watch and more entertaining. Like Berkut's voice acting is insane. It's really good. And he's just a really enjoyable villain for that reason. I feel pretty good leaving it in B tier. I'm just going to say that already. I like that Echoes gives you a handful of villager units, so you can turn them into whatever you want to turn them into. I think that has a lot of room for... gives you a lot of room for optimization, which is good. That's kind of one main reason why I like playing Fire Emblem, is because I just like optimizing tiny things to make my gameplay more efficient. Yeah, having the villagers be open-ended like that, it's also good because it just gives it more replay value when it otherwise wouldn't probably. Yeah, I really I don't have many bad things. I don't have many bad things to say about Echoes, honestly. If anything, I know people don't like the maps in Echoes, and I can get why. But as someone who isn't like a veteran of the series, like when I first played Echoes, I didn't necessarily know what like a well-crafted map looked like. If I went back and played it now, I probably would be more down on the maps. So I'm gonna leave it there. I think it's pretty good. Also, I'm starting to lose my voice, so I might try to speed through Three Houses. Three Houses is the newest game. You can join one of three houses. That's yep, that's the main gimmick for the whole game. I think Three Houses might have my favorite gameplay out of the whole series. I think like there's a huge emphasis on what you can do during player phase, and so you can like use battalions to stride your characters. You can use dancers, obviously. You have combat arts you can use, which are cool. There's just all sorts of shit you can do during player phase, which just makes the gameplay more open-ended. It leaves more room for optimization, which is good. You get what are essentially like 8 villager units, but they're really students, and you can turn them into whatever you want, sort of. You know, like Scythia, you can turn her into whatever you want, but you'd be silly not to turn her into like one of two things. So in that way, Three Houses there isn't as much customization as maybe you would think there'd be, but even still, just having the choice to turn them into whatever they want or whatever you want is really cool. And getting to optimize every little thing during the lectures and during segments where you can explore the monastery, it's just a lot of fun. And I think, especially for the first part of Three Houses, they really nail that gameplay loop where you have the month where you can just kind of dick around with your students, then you do the story map, then you go back and dick around for another month. It's just a really good gameplay loop, and I think like they knew that they nailed it, which is why for the second half of the game, like, you're still doing the same thing. So you're still like exploring the monastery and training your students, even though it doesn't make as much sense thematically to do that. But whatever. I think in terms of story and characters, Three Houses is a very ambitious game because it's basically 3 complete stories, 4 sort of. Yeah, it's 3 complete stories depending on which house you choose, and that's all I really have to say. It's I don't really need to elaborate much more on it. It's very ambitious in what it tries to do, and I think for the most part it succeeds. I think no matter which house you join, you're going to end up liking your house leader, and you're going to end up agreeing with them to some extent. So I played Crimson Flower first, then I played Blue Lions. Actually, that's not true. So I played Crimson Flower. After I beat Crimson Flower with Edelgard, I actually went back to a previous save in that same playthrough so that I could do the Silver Snow route. So that kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. And then after that, I went and did Blue Lions. You would think that the first 12 chapters of the game would be kind of a drag after you've done it already, but it's really not, I don't think, because you know, you can kind of skim over the text and get through pretty quickly if you already know what's going on. And I think like optimizing your units from the beginning once again is just really fun. So I'm actually looking forward to doing that in Golden Deer once I get around to it. Going back to story and characters, people really like the characters in Three Houses, and I think it makes perfect sense why. They're just all pretty memorable. They all have redeeming qualities. They're all multifaceted for the most part. Dimitri might be... He's a contender for like my favorite lord in the series. I think his character arc is just so interesting, and even if it's not done perfectly, it's just so different compared to what they've done previously. So I would say he's up there with like Ike and Micaiah with my favorite lords in the series. Edelgard, similarly, very different from what they've done previously. She's definitely more morally ambiguous than the previous lords. Yeah, she is what she is. I will say the Crimson Flower route's kind of a bummer. You only get 6 chapters you can play after the time skip, so I don't know. If I'm gonna revisit Three Houses years later, I feel like I don't have much reason to join Edelgard's house unless I'm gonna do Silver Snow instead. This kind of goes for all the games, but for Three Houses especially, the music is so good. The map themes are all really good, the monastery theme is good. Just really excellent music. But I mean, all these games up here have good music, so that's not exclusive to Three Houses. I am very much starting to lose my voice, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't know how, like, YouTubers do this. I've been recording for an hour, and my voice is already, like, dying out on me. I'm going to take a minute here to redo my tiers, kind of like I did last time, and see where I end up. Okay, I think I've landed on this for now, so this looks very different. So the top 3 tiers are still the same. Mostly what I did was, I just made sure there was an entire tier separating Birthright and Revelations from everything else, because I think this actually communicates just how much I dislike these 2 games compared to all these, so I'm gonna leave this as is. And I think I moved up Awakening to be up with FE6 and 7, and I think I did end up moving these down from C, but really, it's not so much I'm moving them down, it's more like I just moved up Conquest and Awakening. I moved up Conquest because, like I was saying earlier, I'm just not as down on the story as everybody else, and I think the gameplay is very strong, so yeah, I think that's basically it. I'm looking forward to playing 4 and 5 and 11 at some point. I don't know if they'll go up there, but maybe they will. I thought it might be fun before the end of the video to just kind of talk about what I want to see from the series going forward. You know, kind of describe what my ideal game would be, going off of Three Houses. Maybe like borrow elements from all these games and come up with like an ideal Fire Emblem game for me. So I think they should keep the monastery from Three Houses, where you have like an overworld where you can explore and kind of talk to your units in between each map. I think that was kind of an underrated thing in Three Houses, was that you could talk to your students between every single battle and get their opinion on what's going on. It's really the only game where you can do that, except for maybe like Radiant Dawn, where you have the base conversations. But yeah, I just think it'd be really cool if if we could go back to these old games and have like a monastery where you could explore. Like if you could talk to your units between each chapter and get their opinion on what's going on. I think that'd be really cool. So I want the monastery. I want support conversations, obviously, kind of like Three Houses. I think I want a story that's more streamlined. So in Three Houses and in Fates, they gave you the split route, the split routes you could do, and I'd kind of like them to try to do just a brand new game and a brand new story where there's just one path for you to follow. I know that like the split routes might work better for like social media and stuff, for like social media marketing and all that, but I think they should give it a shot because it's been a while. I know Echoes. I know Echoes is kind of what that is, but even still, I think they should try like a brand new story that's streamlined like that. Speaking of Echoes, I also kind of want them to do the split armies again, like in Radiant Dawn and Echoes. I think if you do that, you have the potential to have just like a more grandiose story, kind of like what you see from Radiant Dawn. So, yeah, I would say that's a pretty good summation of what I want. That's like the ambitious game that I'd be looking for. Although the fact that there aren't like split routes would make it more feasible, I think. Yeah, I think that basically wraps it up. I'm gonna go. If you listen to all this, thank you. And maybe we'll do more tier lists in the future. Bye.